Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour, bienvenue au Club Suisse de la Presse. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome in the Geneva Press Club, welcome online too, for this conference and debate about the future of Taiwan democracy. I thank warmly the Délégation culturelle et économique de Taipei in Geneva, the Geneva office of the Taipei Cultural and Economic Delegation in Switzerland. Thank you for making this moment and talk possible. What are we talking about today? On 13 January 2024, Taiwan held its 8th direct presidential election. Taiwanese people elected a new president and parliament. They successfully demonstrated their conviction for the democratic way of life. The president-elect, Lai Ching-Te, affirms that this is a victory for the democracy and that he's fully committed to maintaining the peace and stability, as well as the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. But during the election process, there was clear evidence of China's interference, ranging from economic coercion to disinformation manipulation. So, democratic Taiwan faces not only China's attempt to influence its election, but also further reaction from China with the intention to sabotage the confidence between the new government and the Taiwanese people, as well as to undermine the trust within Taiwan society. We have the pleasure to have 3 high-level guest speakers today with us. Ambassador Nicole Su, she is the Director General of the Geneva office of the Taipei Cultural and Economic Delegation in Switzerland. Ambassador Su will present the implication of the election. Second of our guest speakers today, Dr. Lionel Fatton. Dr. Lionel Fatton is Assistant Professor in International Relations at Webster University, Geneva. Is also for Webster University, Geneva, Outreach Coordinator to UN and NGOs. Mr. Fatton is also a research collaboration at the Research Institute for the History and Global Arms Transfer in Meiji University in Tokyo. Professor Fatton will share his view on China's interference and its strategy. And third of our guest speakers today, Dr. Jacques deLisle. Jacques deLisle is the director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at University of Pennsylvania. Jacques deLisle is also Stephen A. Cozen Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science. He will expose the Chinese fallacy about the particular resolution passed in 1971 at the UN General Assembly. I first have the pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Nicole Su. Nicole Su, the floor is yours. Oh yeah, if you prefer to... Okay. Well.
Thank you very much, Isabelle.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, Your Excellencies, and our dear friends from the press, from the academia, from missions, from various fields here in Geneva. Thank you very much for coming. So as we have only 1 hour, so I'll try to be brief and quick. Allow me, well, as you have here, allow me to briefly brief you on the election results. Last month, just 30 days ago, on January the 13th, we held our presidential and parliamentary elections. The new president and vice president would be of the 16th term, and the parliament, we call it the legislative yuan, would be the 11th term. And the incumbent vice president, Dr. Lai Ching-Te, was elected as the next president with more than 5.5 million votes, with over 40% of the votes. The parliamentary election results show that no party has secured a majority, which is 57 seats in the parliament. The current ruling party, the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, won the presidency, but did not secure a majority in the parliament, finishing with only 51 seats. The KMT, the Kuomintang Party, secured 52 seats, and the new party, TPP, obtained 8 seats. So our election process is managed in a very transparent manner. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'd see that the ballot counting is done manually with monitor on-site to witness the counting process. Right after the polling process closes, staff at each polling station open the boxes of the ballots and announce out loud which candidate was voted on the ballot. Then they would immediately display the ballots for the monitors for each party to see. Another staff would then mark it down on the board, the tally board clearly, so that the general public could see the results. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that, of course, the counting process is in all polling stations are all live streaming on TV, on the internet, for everyone to follow any minute of the during the process. So at the end of the same day, the result would be officially announced by the election committee, which is in this case 10:30 at night that particular Saturday evening. So it's a fair and free election, including the process and before the election. So we're talking about the before the election, with unfortunately the interference, China's. Prior to the election, Taiwan was under unprecedented interference from China through tactics including political, military, economic, and cognitive warfare altogether, in fact. In terms of political pressure, as you can see that China's experts, China exerts its malicious influence over the international organizations to block Taiwan's international participation for years. And during the period of last year's campaign for the election, the pressure is even higher. The intention very clearly is to thwart the confidence of the Taiwanese people to participate, to discourage them to participate in the election process. And then furthermore, while China itself interferes in the Taiwanese election, they themselves actually interfere and ask others not to interfere. For example, during the APEC last August, the China, Korea, Japan foreign ministers meeting in November, and the China-EU summit, as well as China foreign ministers conversation with State Secretary of State Blinken last December, all very aggressively mentioned that warn these other countries not to interfere with Taiwanese election, while on the other hand, they themselves are doing exactly the same. China's intention to use these above-mentioned political pressure to undermine international support for a free and democratic election is very clearly demonstrated in the past few months in Taiwan. In terms of military intimidation, China's intimidating maneuvers include military exercises and gray zone activities. Of course, you would see that this is very, the pictures that you see, very tiny, very small, but then this is just to show you how frequent and how aggressive these maneuvers are. In 2023 alone, we were altogether, there were altogether more than 4,700 sorties of Chinese aircraft venturing around Taiwan. Among them, more than 1,700 crossing the median line of the Taiwan Strait. In addition to the fighter jets, of course, there were also Chinese warships, drones, and they're trespassing and over even high-altitude balloons flying directly over Taiwan. So the intention, again, is very clear, they try to create the sense of insecurity to undermine the trust among the Taiwanese society. In terms of economic coercion, I'm just giving you a few examples. In August 2022, China banned imports of several agricultural products and fish from Taiwan as part of its reaction towards the then Speaker of the House, Mrs. Pelosi, visit to Taiwan in August 2022. So here comes the carrots. In December last year, the Chinese actually lifted some of the bans on these agricultural products just days before the election. And then similar coercion strategy was used on trade items. Before our election in mid-December, China decided to terminate the zero tariff treatment on several, 12 altogether, Taiwan's petrochemical products. Under those were arrangements done and arranged in the bilateral agreement in 2010. So they, in December, announced that, okay, they're going to terminate these zero tariff treatment, but 2 weeks before the actual voting, they said that, oh, they will reconsider whether they would actually suspend these tariff waiver treatment or not. Interestingly, Chinese themselves kind of actually admitted that this is a political interference, because in terms of the agricultural products, for example, fish, they were saying that, well, these bans could be negotiable, depends on these companies' position, which kind of like clear what position are they looking at. If these companies are into standing for the position of the Chinese, then their products could be, the ban could be lifted. So this is one of the economic coercion from the Chinese. And cognitive manipulation as well. Several scenario, fake posts, disinformation, misinformation, fear-mongering, and coax and enticement. For example, the fake posts they did actually produce certain look very fancy statistics of the polls actually favor specific candidates that with the intention to mislead the voters. And disinformation campaign could be so extravagant, saying that, oh, Washington and Taipei are actually working together to develop certain biochemical weapons together, or they are creating sense of insecurity that there was a drastic nationwide shortage of eggs and so on. So these are the kind of misinformation, disinformation strategy that they're using. Manufacturing fear of potential conflict across the Taiwan Strait. So this is fear-mongering for sure, because they're trying to create a sense that in this election you are choosing either war or peace, or you're choosing prosperity or depression. So these are the kind of messages, and trying to create, again, to damage the trust among the society, and also to damage the trust and the confidence between people and governments. And of course, like coax and enticement, you can imagine, for example, like free trips to visit Taiwan with air tickets and hotel accommodation and so on being paid by the Chinese so that you enjoy more of the Taiwanese favor. So these are the kind of just a few types of the cognitive manipulation that they're using during the time of our election. So even though, despite these Chinese tactics to undermine our election, Taiwan adopted a multifaceted approach to counter disinformation and other interference. Our government set up disinformation rapid response task force, aiming to publish fact and correct information to the public within 4 hours of detection of these disinformation being shared. And civil society groups work together with social media platforms to target as disinformation as well. As in fact, the crowdsourced fact checkers have been quick to respond, compensating the efforts of the government and government official bodies or the journalist media as well. So Taiwan's successful, I would imagine that I could fairly say that we are successfully counter these interference measures was demonstrated clearly by the high turnout of the voters. In this election, we could see that there are actually more than 70% of the voters was very active in participating and casting their votes on their favorite candidates and political parties. So even so, unfortunately, after the election, China's intimidation continues. Unfortunately, China has been continuing its effort through diplomatic approach to lure our allies away, to switch their recognition. Unfortunately, this time, more than 106 countries in the world with over 1,004 international friends across the world congratulated Taiwan on the smooth completion of our election and a victory of democracy. 2 days later, after this election, China lured Nauru to terminate diplomatic relations with Taiwan. What is tricky in this case, that Nauru adopted PRC's false narrative to state that their move to China is in line with United Nations General Assembly's Resolution 2758, which is not the case at all. Because unfortunately, the PRC and Taiwan have never been subordinate to one another. And actually, this resolution, which you have at hand right now, deals with only credential issue. It does not say anything about Taiwan, not to mention that it does not say anything about Taiwan being part of China. So this distortion of the UNGA resolution and its willful association with the Chinese One China principle is contrary to the fact which many countries would oppose to. So we have Professor deLisle to talk to us about that further. In terms of other reactions from China, as you can see that China actually unilaterally adjusts one of the flight routes just days before. On 30th of January, without prior communication with Taiwan, China announced unilateral change to the operation of this M503 flight route, with a few other east-west flight routes also changing. So this unilateral change of relevant flight route is actually in violation of the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization's regulations. And it actually poses a lot of safety risks to those flights flying around in the FIR, the Flight Information Region controlled by Taiwan in our region. So this is a very irresponsible and very risky and dangerous approach for the Chinese to unilaterally change the flight route. So as you can see, look into the future. The new president and vice president will assume office on May the 20th. The new government, of course, would also be formed then accordingly. From President-elect Lai's speech on the election night, looking ahead, the government policy, I think, remains the same, calm and non-provocative but dignified path. Taiwan's free and fair election clearly demonstrate that democracy with transparency, accountability, and good governance is possible in Asia, contrary to what the Chinese have been saying. So furthermore, we have been able to achieve a free and fair election under as I mentioned, these are Chinese interference through political, economic, military, and disinformation, altogether a hybrid warfare. We have been able to conduct a fair and open election. So I think Taiwan's resilience and experience offers important lessons for the global democracies to share and to learn from each other. So looking ahead, Taiwan is fully committed to deepening cooperation with fellow democracies and to safeguard our shared values. Through collective efforts, we can shape a future where democracy and freedom prevails. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nicole Su. And I have the pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Lionel Fatton from Webster University. Please, Mr. Fatton, the floor is yours and the microphone is already on. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabelle. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll try to keep it below the 10 minutes, but because I'm French speaker, I tend to speak a lot. But I will try to be short. I'm not a legal expert at all, so I will not talk about the resolutions, the 1992 consensus, anything. What I want you to think about today is actually what was reported on the Taiwan election and the Chinese interference in this election. When I basically read the news in the wake of the election, I saw a consensus in Western media that was basically saying the result of the election is bad for China, and the Chinese interferences in the Taiwanese elections were a failure. I disagree with both. So you may disagree with me, and that's why we may have a debate, but I disagree with both. Why? Because I think one of the arguments of this editorial line saying that the interferences by China in the Taiwanese elections were a failure, one of the arguments was saying, well, this military pressure that Ambassador Su was mentioning led actually to the three candidates from the KMT, the DPP, and the TPP to actually pledge to boost national defense and also to maintain a close cooperation with the United States and with Japan for some of them. So clearly it seems that the military pressure by China on Taiwan has counterproductive effects because Taiwan is now gaining momentum in rearming itself, boosting deterrence. Now, when you want to basically detect whether one country has achieved its objectives, you have to define the objectives. From my point of view, China, with military pressure, was not seeking actually to do other things than to make sure that the three candidates had a political platform during the election that were not overly provocative against China. In other words, a platform that was not confrontational against China. And I think China somehow succeeded in this regard. If you look at the three candidates, and as the slide of Ambassador Su regarding President-elect Lai shows, he pledged to maintain the status quo. He also said explicitly that he is open to dialogue with China. In other words, China here basically scored a point, a small point, but a point, because Lai was basically prevented from having a platform that was more confrontational against Beijing. This is one point. The second point is more interesting from my point of view. Regarding cognitive offensive, cognitive warfare of China, so disinformation, misinformation, and etc. Some people, especially in Western media, are saying, well, Lai was elected, this is a failure from China. Well, yes, this is a failure if you consider that China was aiming at supporting its favorite candidate in the race. This was not the case from my point of view. China, the Communist Party of China, is not as naive as it was in 1996. It has learned. The Communist Party is an entity that adapts extremely rapidly to the trends, and it has understood something. If you want to weaken a democracy, do not try to support the candidate that fits the best your benefits. Try to polarize the society. Try to basically make sure that the population is more and more distrustful vis-à-vis its public institution. And this is why you see over the past few years, China changing its tactics when it comes to cognitive offensive vis-à-vis Taiwan. It's no more about saying China is the best country of the world, civilization, economic development, join us. Now it's a negative offensive, meaning it is about, in the election, depicting the DPP as a dangerous independentist party that actually will lead Taiwan down the wrong path of war. Now I'm not saying that it worked, but I'm saying that China has positioned its cognitive offensive in a market that is extremely interesting. And just to make my point, look at the TPP. The TPP is a populist party, at least his leader. It is a leader that says, well, the KMT and the DPP are ideologically grounded parties. They are old. This is the establishment. He is populist in this regard. Okay? And therefore, if you want, China has understood that Generation Z is the one to fight over. And I think many countries have understood that this is the future of the Chinese cognitive warfare vis-à-vis Taiwan, the Generation Z. Example of that, 1 day or 2 days after the election, a US delegation landed on Taiwan. Even before departing from the US mainland, they said explicitly, we will talk to all stakeholders, meaning DPP, KMT, TPP. Over there, they also explicitly said, we are eager to work with all political stakeholders in Taiwan. Why is the United States saying so? Well, it's pretty clear. They know that China actually will target this Generation Z. And it knows that China actually will target the Parliament of Taiwan in the years to come. In other words, what China will do in the near future is to take advantage of the fact that the Parliament is dominated by the KMT. As Ambassador Su mentioned, the KMT has 52 seats. You can add to that 2 seats from independents because they are pretty close to the KMT. 8 seats for the TPP, the majority being 57. By definition, you can have a very strong opposition. What China will do with cognitive warfare in the years to come is basically to make sure that the opposition in the parliament to the Lai government is as strong as possible. Why is that? Because simply China understands. The more the Lai government will be unable to deliver on its promises because of stalemate in the parliament, the more China will be able to have basically a lack of trust by the population in its political institution. And this is a success for China to have this kind of parliament. So again, focusing only on the presidential election for me is a wrong way to see the results from the Chinese point of view. Finally, just jumping maybe on what comes next, I already said. I think China in the months to come will focus again on seeing whether the opposition in the parliament is strong enough to make sure that President Lai is bound somehow in the exercise of his political power. The strongest and more organized the opposition in the parliament to the Lai government, the better for China. It's as simple as that. And therefore, I think the cognitive warfare in the next few months will be dedicated to that, to somehow help this opposition crystallize itself. Now, by definition, the United States will try to do the opposite. That's why they want to talk to the TPP and the KMT to try to somehow smooth the opposition to the Lai government inside the parliament. So China, I think, will focus on that in the months to come. Now the question is whether China will take overly provocative measures against Taiwan in the months to come. I don't think so. I think this is also something that has to be pinpointed. Many people were extremely alarmist when Lai was elected. Well, China will do huge military exercises more than before. This has not been the case. China has been restrained. Well, there are a few reasons to explain that. One, China will again look at how the opposition in the Taiwanese parliament is able to constrain the Lai government. If the opposition is strong enough to make sure that the Lai government is not effectively delivering on its promises, China doesn't have a lot of need to go further than that. China has time. This is something that has to be kept in mind. The time is on the side of China, not Taiwan. And therefore, China can wait. Second point, this is 2024. And at the end of the year, you know what's happening in the United States of America. China will wait. China wants to stay out of, to stay out of a crossfiring of China bashing between Biden and clearly Trump, okay, the two candidates that will run for presidency. And this is especially the case because the relationship between Beijing and Washington is improving recently, with military-to-military cooperation recovering slowly, but recovering, and etc. And given the difficult domestic situation in the mainland, China has absolutely no interest of basically having a downturn in its improving relationship with the United States. And therefore, China, I think, will be pretty quiet, low profile this year because of the US election. Last point, one reason for why China will be pretty quiet this year, again, focusing on cognitive warfare, but not on military provocations, is Japan. So I am a Japan specialist by formation. So I'm happy to be able to bring it because we always forget Japan in the picture. There will be in Japan this year an election, that's for sure, because Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, his term as head of the Liberal Democratic Party expires in October. He has very, very low approval rating. He will have to call for a parliamentary election, that's for sure. We don't know when. China understands that over the past few years, Japan has been more and more engaged in the cross-strait dynamics. Japan has become closer to Taiwan. So of course, Japan is not the United States, but Japan is the springboard for the United States when it comes to a potential military intervention in or around the Taiwan Strait. Without Japan, the United States in Asia is simply in a position of immobility, militarily speaking. And therefore, the Beijing will also wait to see how the political dynamics evolve in Japan before maybe going overly aggressive. We can talk about that. China will clearly not attack Taiwan in the next few years. This is a myth. But I will say in terms of raising the military temperature in the Strait, I will tend to think that China this year will remain extremely low profile while focusing on, again, boosting the parliamentary opposition to the Lai government to make sure that Lai governs as facing as many obstacles as possible, and therefore, if you want, affecting its credibility in the eyes of the Taiwanese population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fatton. So I'm pleased to welcome now Monsieur Jacques deLisle, professor at University of Pennsylvania. Jacques deLisle, the floor is yours, and you can have that microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have the PowerPoint as well?
Yes, it's coming. Here you are.
Yeah. I would congratulate Taiwan on yet another democratic election that's come off quite successfully, as Ambassador Su described. But Taiwan still faces an existential threat. You've heard a little bit about that from Dr. Fatton. And what I want to do is talk about one aspect of this. Part of the threat comes from China and its increasingly aggressive pushing of its version of the One China principle and the argument that that follows from UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 and sort of parallel documents elsewhere in the UN system, including WHO Resolution 25.1. A lot of words up there, but basically China claims in its 2022 white paper that 2758 settled the question of Taiwan's status legally and put it in the category of China's One China principle, Taiwan province of China, and so on. That's not new. China's been saying that for a long time, but it's put in an even stronger form in the white paper 2022, and that white paper also cites an official legal interpretation from the Office of Legal Affairs at the UN. And then if you cast about through Chinese sources, not only is that idea there for a long time, but it has again been getting stronger. There's one wonderful statement in a letter to the OHCHR that says 2758 is legally binding on all member states. Now, what's at stake? If China wins this argument and gets its One China principle accepted as a matter of international law, then it can say that the use of force against Taiwan or the threat of force does not run afoul of the international legal proscriptions on the use or threat of force against the territorial integrity or political autonomy of a state. And it makes the US, Japan, and others possible defense of Taiwan or actions to deter China as interference in China's internal affairs. So although law will not resolve these things, it's better to have the law on your side than against you when dealing with the very fraught politics of cross-strait crises. And so China's claims and the UN statements and actions that seem, at least on the surface, to align with China's position, we can see coming out in four flawed strands in the PRC argument that has won some traction within the UN. I'm going to go through each of those relatively briefly. But we first need to start with the resolution itself. As you heard from Ambassador Su, Resolution 2758 doesn't even mention the word Taiwan or the phrase Republic of China. What it does is address which government's representatives, the ROC or the PRCs, will occupy the Chinese seat, the seat of the state of China in the UN. It is really a credentialing question, not a membership or a representation question. And Zhou Enlai, at the time that 2758 was adopted, was not happy with it. The resolution left the Taiwan issue unresolved in his mind, and at least 30 of the countries that voted on 2758 saw it as a credentials question, not a membership or representation question. And the Security Council was not involved, which you would need for a membership decision. And the US tried to get it labeled an important question and failed. So all of this sort of downplays what went on in 2758 to being a lot less than China claims. And of course, if China were right, the UN General Assembly would in effect be functioning as an international legislature or an international court, and it has neither one of those powers. So in effect, China is saying the UN did something outside its powers and prerogative. Now, to go through the strands that come up in this PRC line of argument. First, there is this Office of Legal Affairs memorandum, which is cited in the 2022 Chinese White Paper, that essentially says all UN documents shall refer to Taiwan province of China. It also says that the United Nations considers Taiwan as a province of China with no separate status. Now, the operative part of this document is quite limited. It says, in UN documents, say Taiwan province of China. And it does not actually need to say, nor is there any legal basis for saying the United Nations, in some corporate sense, considers Taiwan as a province of China. Notably, this OLA memorandum, if you look at it in full, rejects a proposed footnote that would have said it's incorrect to say Taiwan province of China, and instead says we distribute this report submitted to the OHCR the way it was submitted by Nauru, which was then a diplomatic ally. We don't comment on or change the language, and the use of the problematic language, which was Taiwan or ROC rather than province of China, that there's no opinion of the Secretariat anywhere in this about the status of a country, territory, or its authority. So it's really very limited. But what we see over time is a slide toward the Chinese view of the One China principle here. So you see this slide to the point where by the time you get to the late 20-teens, the UN Sustainable Development Goals entity is no longer accepting that footnote. It's no longer accepting documents as written where many of Taiwan's diplomatic partners submit reports that say, we thank Taiwan or we thank the Republic of China for help. It just won't accept those. And even with the disclaimer footnote, you see similar things going on with the OHCHR. Second strand is some unfortunate language for Taiwan from various UN entities all the way up to the Secretary General, including Ban Ki-moon, where you see Taiwan referred to as an integral part of China or the PRC for all intents and purposes, mix and match language here. And this comes up in a variety of contexts. One is proposals by Taiwan's diplomatic allies' missions at the UN for full membership, occasionally, that was 2007 in the Chun years, or more often some lesser form of representation. The most famous one is when Ban Ki-moon uses that language, but really it goes all the way back to 1993 in response to the first Lee Teng-hui presidency era bid for inclusion in the UN, and China pushes back in each round. Now here again there are limits. Ban Ki-moon notably retreated after he was slapped down by the US, Japan, and Taiwan's diplomatic allies, saying he was going to drop the unhelpful language that refers to Taiwan as a part of China. Taiwan also, but there's even, again here, less than meets the eye in China's selective framing of this. Taiwan, the Secretary General's office said, is not permanently barred from applying. That's a decision for the General Assembly membership and ultimately the Security Council for talking membership. And the practice remained of circulating documents that proposed Taiwan's membership or participation with references to Taiwan and the Republic of China distributed as written and distributed fully to the General Assembly. And if you dig into the archives of the UN on this, there's an interesting set of exchanges within the Secretariat, between the Secretary General's office and the Office of Legal Affairs, where they essentially say, no, you tell them it can't do Taiwan. No, you tell them. The Secretary General said, I'm going to stick this on OLA. You have to put out that letter. And OLA comes back and says, well, okay, here's a bunch of stuff we found in the files that are the most anti-Taiwan language, so okay, we'll do it. But clearly not seen as an obvious or easy call. The similar phenomenon occurs where Taiwan's diplomatic allies try to submit on behalf of Taiwan instruments for accession to the major UN treaties, particularly the two human rights covenants, also CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And here we get a second OLA memorandum coming up in a related context. And that's the third element here of this strand, which is where the question is, can holders of Taiwan passports, can ROC nationals participate in UN activities or even enter UN facilities? And this prompts a second OLA memorandum from March of 2010, 7 months before the earlier one, where it says the UN considers Taiwan for all purposes to be an integral part of the People's Republic of China without any separate status, a backsliding to the language that Ban Ki-moon said he would abandon. But here again, the memo itself is quite limited. There is this dictum about how the UN views Taiwan, but it's really a very narrow question. Can you get into a UN meeting with a passport of a government that is not represented at the UN? Easy call to say no. And there was an OLA note in 2009 that took that narrower approach, and I think sort of got amplified through this 2010 memorandum. And the practice has been mixed. At times, Taiwanese ROC passport holders have gotten into UN meetings and UN facilities. You see ROC nationals often, at least, well, not often, but at times, being experts in other countries' delegations, usually, again, diplomatic allies. Yet another strand in this is the discussion of recognition. Now, it's hard to know where this fits in. The term recognizing and to recognize is there in the text of 2758, which they helpfully printed out for you at the entry there. But it's not recognition in the sense of recognizing a state or a government, or recognizing that a state of China exists and includes Taiwan. But there's lots in the UN files and documentation where China is very sensitive to anything that looks like, quote, implying recognition of Taiwan. You see this in WHO context and other places as well. And implicitly, I think what you have here is the PRC is claiming that the non-recognition of the ROC or Taiwan implies acceptance of China's one China principle that includes Taiwan as part of China. There's also an element scattered through here, especially when China starts citing the imbalance of diplomatic recognitions, only 12 left for Taiwan, as showing a lack of capacity to engage in international relations because it can't do the formal thing. That's part of the criteria of statehood and international law, so it's pushing back against that. But here too, there's less than meets the eye. The UN is explicit from 1950 onward in saying the UN does not have the capacity to recognize states or governments. That's for member states to do, and so it can't be that 2758 did that. There's a lot of pushback. It goes all the way back actually to one of the first events after 2758 was passed, when the Central News Agency of Taiwan was kicked out as the official government news agency because the ROC was no longer in the UN. And there was a big pushback from the UN Correspondents Association that essentially attacked the legal analysis that seemed to verge on recognition. And of course, whether or not you're recognized and whether or not you're a member of the UN has nothing to do with statehood. We're sitting here in Switzerland. Switzerland didn't join the UN until long after everybody recognized that Switzerland was a state. There were 3 Soviet seats in the UN back in the day, so statehood and membership don't exactly align. And if you really believe recognition matters, then you're into the constitutive theory of international statehood, which is a real mess that I don't have time to get into. The final strand that China has been playing here is essentially an argument that now takes it quite dangerously for Taiwan outside the UN context and into arguments about customary international law ostensibly binding on all states. So you see China complaining about UN human rights officials going to Taiwan in their individual capacities to participate in Taiwan's equivalent of the Universal Periodic Review that a member of the UN Human Rights Conventions would undertake. You also see Taiwan kicked out of the Central American Parliament in a move that cites 2758 as the basis. You see it with the Nauru diplomatic recognition, citing 2758, also new. And you see a PRC letter to the Geneva mission saying, we hope all international organizations, not just the UN ones, but all international organizations in Geneva will continue to adhere to the One China principle. So we see an increasingly aggressive position and trying to link it ever closer to 2758. Now the problem here is that this is ultimately, I think, a claim about customary international law, and you see this if you sort of piece together some of the quotations and strands in the white paper and other sources. But ultimately, Beijing's One China principle is a really bad candidate for customary international law. Customary international legal rules usually have some generality. It's not Taiwan as part of China, it's, what are the criteria for statehood, what are the criteria for diplomatic immunity, things like that. And China tries to rely here on the lopsided vote for 2758, but that's problematic. Lots of states thought it was just a credentialing problem, and Zhou Enlai didn't think it solved the problem. And if you tote up diplomatic recognition, China likes to say all those ties are based on accepting China's One China principle. Now maybe if you buy China's reading of 2758 and you're Nauru, you get there. But if you go through the archaeology, and it's obvious in the US's treatment in many other countries, that they don't accept Beijing's One China principle as a basis for establishing diplomatic relations with the PRC. And finally, China has hints of an estoppel argument here. That is, in 1971, Taipei and Beijing both agreed that it was one China that included Taiwan, and now you can never change that. Well, that's not really how international law works either. And of course, we've now had a series of, I think we will soon be up to 5 Taiwanese presidents who have begged to differ with that old Chiang Kai-shek era view. So why has Beijing succeeded? There are a few reasons. One is the UN's a favorable venue. One state, one vote. It's a low salience issue for most states, so they can be pressured or persuaded, and Taiwan's not present in part of the discussion. Secondly, no issue is too small. China's pressure is relentless. If you go through the archives, there are constant meetings. Every little slight, every little departure from orthodoxy, that is China's orthodoxy, gets pushed back against. And there hasn't been, and in a sense, they've been pushing against an open door. There are a lot of Chinese nationals serving at high levels in UN agencies that are fairly sympathetic to the PRC view. There is a certain drift among the legally non-expert. The Secretary General is above the lawyers, and many of these implementing officials down at the UNDESA level aren't legally trained, so they kind of stumble into exaggerated views of what OLA has done and what 2758 did. And I think there's a little bit of a dance here that OLA sees itself as the lawyers who have to do what the Secretary General wants, at least to come up with legal rationales where they're tenable. And on the other hand, the Secretary General likes to hide behind ostensible OLA guidance so he doesn't have to take the political hit, and that becomes a vicious cycle. And finally, weaker pushback. That is, the other side, the US and like-minded states, and Taiwan's diplomatic partners have sometimes been very good at this, but they haven't been as consistent or as forceful as China has been. So what do we do about it? Well, one strategy is to match the PRC with more robust pushback and getting outside the narrow UN context, calling for UN transparency about MOUs and communications with China on the Taiwan issue, and calling out the China's misinterpretations of international law and UN resolutions that I've been talking about here. And then you can frame the issue by saying what China is saying with its insistence that 2758 means the one China principle as Beijing defines it, is that its claims in effect the UN has done something the UN does not have the power to do. It has misconstrued what official legal guidance within the UN has been. It is essentially disrespecting the sovereignty of those states that want to put in documents that say Taiwan or Republic of China without the provincial moniker. And that what is going on here is against the UN principles of rule of law and universal representation. And I think to broaden the lens a little bit, this is an example, and a particularly pointed and formal one, of China's broader agenda to undermine existing international legal rules and institutions and reframe them in a way that serves China's interests. And finally, even if you were to buy China's view, that its one China principle is part of international law, that doesn't end the discussion. It has the effects I talked about in the first slide, but there are still constraints on Chinese behavior. Chinese assaults or threats against Taiwan could be threats to international peace and security, therefore cognizable by the UN, although China would veto anything in the Security Council, but it would get it on the agenda in a Russia-Ukraine-like way, and many things that China would do would transgress other international legal limits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeLisle. Yes, please stay with us. I will ask Mr. Fatton and Ambassador Nicole Su to come back here. I will have a very few questions so that you can react to what has just been said. So, Mrs. Su, maybe just to start with a personal question, what are your personal hopes today about Taiwan?
I think I'm not speaking on myself only. I would be speaking on behalf of the Taiwanese people that what we are hoping for is the maintenance of the current status quo, and also our way of life, of freedom and democratic way of life. That will be the hope of all Taiwanese people.
Mm-hmm, yeah. Mr. Fatton spoke about this Generation Z. Do you, Mrs. Su, have a comment, or what do you think about this Generation Z? Do you think it is a good explanation of what's going on, and do you think they have they carry the Taiwan's main hopes, this famous notorious Generation Z? Do you have any do you think about No, because you were speaking about Generation Z, so Mrs. Su, do you have any comment about Generation Z?
I think the interesting thing is that the diversity of Taiwan, we welcome and accommodate different voices. As you can see from this election, of course, a president-elect won 40% of the vote, but then there are other voices, and people are freely able to discuss different ideas and different perspective on whatever issue. So for the Generation Z, I have my hope for them that yes, they may have different view, but then they are still able to be freely discuss them. So I am very have a positive view on our future. Ruled by the Generation Z.
Yeah. In Geneva, we have, of course, United Nations, but we also have World Health Organization, and Taiwan is not a member of the World Health Organization, and is, of course, then excluded of WHO's meetings. As we know, World Health Organization and its members are currently discussing establishing a pandemic treaty, and also discussions the amendments to the international health regulations, which are very important discussions going on. Both are planned to be concluded in May already. Can Taiwan participate in these international treaties? And what would happen if Taiwan cannot be part of these treaties?
Thank you, Isabelle. I think this is indeed a very serious question. Right now, of course, we're still hoping that this pandemic treaty is not concluded yet, and the amendment of the IHR, the international health regulations, are not completed yet. So we're still hopeful that there will be opportunities for Taiwan to be part of the mechanisms. If indeed it is not possible for Taiwan to be participating in the new pandemic treaty or the IHR, I'm afraid that that will be a big loss to the global community. Not for Taiwan, but for the global community. As if you're having a mechanism, if you're building a global mechanism, you need all the countries, all the partners to be part of it, rather than excluding or, well, trying to forget that there are certain parts which is not fully incorporated. So I think this indeed, thank you, Isabelle, for the question. That is going to be a question that we will have to think about seriously. Thank you.
I have a last question before, of course, you, ladies and gentlemen, can ask questions, and please, online, prepare your questions too. We are here in Geneva, so close to the Place des Nations, and of course, United Nations. What are your expectations about what can Geneva, international Geneva, or even Switzerland maybe do? Do you have any expectations about what can be done, dialogues, as far as you are concerned, Ambassador Su?
Yes, I think the advantage of being here in Geneva is that we have the community which welcomes and open your arms to the international different voices, which is a perfect location for more dialogues, more debates at this similar to this event. And we have accommodating media and accommodating society and accommodating Swiss people who are open to the idea of free and people's choice, which matters most, and also this freedom of democracy. I think this is what we are hoping to achieve and to let the Swiss people and the Geneva community to know more about Taiwan and our situation, which matters to the global community.
We'll open the discussion to the public. Yes, so please let us know who you are, please. Thank you.
Robert James Parsons, independent journalist. A question, first off, for Ambassador Su. Could you clarify the situation of the election in terms of the turnout? Is every Taiwanese citizen automatically registered as a voter, which is the case in Switzerland, or do these people have to register or they can't vote, which is the case in the United States? And in terms of that, what was the turnout overall out of the total population of voters or registered voters? And then a second question, do you still have a cross-straits relations minister? And if so, what is this minister's mandate and what is happening with this person now?
Yes, with regard to the first question, the turnout was 70% of the voters. And in the case of Taiwan, you do not really need to register. There are conditions that you are able to vote. You have to live in Taiwan. Being citizen, you have to live in Taiwan for 6 months before you can vote let's say, to make sure that you have the right to vote. So if like in my case, I've been here in Switzerland for 3 years, so actually I have not been able to live in Taiwan for consecutively 6 months, which unfortunately means that I cannot vote here because unfortunately we do not also have the possibility to vote overseas or by mail. So in short, there is no need for registration. As long as you're a citizen of Taiwan, you can vote. And I'm sorry about your second question, I don't quite get.
I'll give you back the microphone.
Yes.
The cross-straits minister. I remember on previous trips to Taiwan, way back in the end of the 1990s, the beginning of this century, there was a great deal of discussion about the role of this person in smoothing things with China, cultivating Chinese tourism in Taiwan, and so on. And I hear nothing about this person. Does this post still exist? And if so, what is the role of this person given the tension between the two sides of the straits?
I think we have been able to conduct a very non-provocative attitudes towards our cross-strait relations. No particular person would be mediating this cross-strait relation, because I think in a way that we have been open to dialogue and conversation on a parity and on the basis of parity and dignity. So we've been maintaining the same position over the past years already. So in a way that I think we are always welcome conversation and dialogue with China.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Hi, Martin Desipinto, Independent. Just want to ask to what extent internal issues in China, specifically referring to things like a real estate crisis, which has kicked over into banking and to the markets. We've got deflation that's kicked in this year as well. We've got quite a lot of pushback across the globe on the Belt and Road Initiative as well from various countries. To what extent are these issues restraining China's foreign policy at the moment?
Go first, and then Lionel probably have more observation. I think it is indeed quite a serious situation in China. To a certain extent, I think it will affect Chinese foreign policy in a way that I could perhaps come back to Lionel, your point as to how calm China would be, I mean, in terms of their policy towards Taiwan, because there is this factor, domestic factor, that obviously the economy is not doing well. Is there a need for the Chinese, unfortunately, to create this external factor to try to make sure that the domestic situation is calmer?
Yes. Rebounding on that, there is this famous argument that doesn't apply to China about the scapegoating. Meaning, internally, the government is under pressure, will try to create an external threat to unify the social fabric and etc., keep social stability. The argument is interesting and has applied in history, but only to risk-acceptant actors. The Communist Party of China is one of the most risk-averse actors I have detected in the international system today. In other words, there is in the Communist Party a zero tolerance for risk. In other words, those screaming Chinese economy is crumbling, Evergrande, country garden, diversion of the attention of the citizens outside by creating a conflict or a contingency in the Taiwan Strait, these are people who do not know what they are talking about. So that's one of the reasons, as ambassadors who say, of the low profile of China nowadays. Also one of the reasons why China is trying to reach out to the United States and accepting military-to-military cooperation, because China has absolutely no interest of having a hot point in the Taiwan Strait today. Absolutely none. And again, keep that in mind if you want to understand the positioning of China on the international scene and its macro project like the BRI. China is risk-averse. Meaning it will strive to advance its pawns on the chessboard as long as the risk is not high. It has faced a lot of pushbacks on the BRI, typically Eastern Europe, we know it. Italy is basically going out. It will take a very long time for China to restart an offensive on the BRI in these countries. The BRI nowadays, to be honest, in terms of concrete project and consequences, is the China-Pakistan economic corridor. That's the BRI today. Then there are different projects in the Pacific Islands, in Africa, in Latin America, but they are not strategic. Only the Pakistan-China corridor is the focus of Beijing today when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative.
I would agree with Lionel on the idea that China is, the evidence for diversionary war is pretty weak globally, and historically it's especially weak in the context of what the CCP is up to. So if you want to find danger points here, I think they're fairly remote, but if you want to look for them, the basis of legitimacy on the mainland is shifting away from economic performance and toward nationalism. Now, the party still has a great deal of control over nationalism. It runs some risks when it gins that up to its own ends. And the Chinese phrase, when you mount the tiger, it's hard to dismount. So there is some risk on that front, but it's fairly remote. The Taiwan scenarios, I mean, the risk of conflict is definitely up from where it was, but it's still pretty low. But I think if you want to analyze whether that would happen, it's not because the real estate crisis is hit or the economy is doing badly. It would be if it became an existential problem for the party and for Xi Jinping. And there are certain circumstances, I don't think we're anywhere near there yet, but if they thought the Taiwan question had gotten so far away from them that they could no longer have the fig leaf of someday unification will be possible, then you get into a very bad scenario because then they think about whether they have to act to prevent that, and once they do, the threat of economic costs and all of that just doesn't factor into it. So I mean, that's the nightmare scenario. It's off a cliff, but the cliff is still pretty far away.
Just follow up on that. I completely agree. Something to keep in mind when it comes to the Taiwan contingency. Again, starting from a theoretical point, countries never attack, never in history when they have an advantage militarily speaking, only for this reason. Countries do not attack because they think they will win. They attack when they are dissatisfied with the status quo and they see that they have a chance to actually advance their interest through the use of force. In other words, it is not because China is nowadays taking the lead in terms of the balance of military power across the strait, then China will attack. China will attack when it will be between a rock and a hard place in terms of the party's legitimacy. And therefore, that's why, I mean, the Taiwanese line of saying, we keep the status quo, from my point of view, reduce to not null, but to a very low probability the risk of China doing something bad in the near future. Because China, as long as Taiwan says status quo, China is satisfied with that. It's enough so far.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, status quo, not that. Riyad Bazia, I'm an international correspondent and international expert in the UN with my observer status. I have a quick question to you, Mrs. Ambassador, but not about the attack, and because I was thinking about another case in Western Sahara, and it is another context. But my question about health, quick question, and following what Mrs. Isabelle raised also in WHO, because a discussion inside WHO between experts on health and the WHO, it's not PAO. PAO, Pan-American Health Organizations, and anyway, the international health negotiation, it is in WHO, and PAO exists before WHO. Anyway, the global initiative on infection control have been launched also by experts on health last Congress here in Geneva, and it is possible also, as I discussed with Mrs. Kuku, member of your mission, it is possible also for experts on health to join this initiative. Because usually the initiative is presented by experts, and you can also join the initiative on infection control. Are you, delegation of Taiwan, is it ready? Is it motivated to join the global initiative? Will be presented next May in General Assembly.
Well, thank you very much for your question. Yes, we are always ready. Taiwan is always ready to be fully committed, to be able to make a contribution wherever there is an opportunity. In these couple of years, we've always have our delegation coming in May, every May at the World Health Assembly during the time to have a delegation here and very happily making a contribution, if possible, to participate in the discussion. So these are our efforts and our willingness to make a contribution. And of course, this is a global network. Not that Taiwan has the poster child experience of everything. There are needs that Taiwan also needs from the global community. That this is a network where everyone helps each other. So I think we are very willing to, and this has been one of the how do you say, we are participating in a professional way and try to make a meaningful contribution in a pragmatic manner. So this has been our hope, and hopefully this May we will be able to participate in some of the discussion, if not all. Thank you.
Another questions or comment?
Boris Engelson, a local journalist freelance. I have a question for the ambassador and another one for either of the two other speakers. What is the stance of the sole legitimate spokespeople for Taiwan, that is the Aboriginal indigenous people, which have become very trendy? The movie industry is talking a lot about them. Of course, saying today that they are the sole representative is a bit of a joke, but still, what is their attitude, and what is the attitude of the Beijing government vis-à-vis this issue? Because the Aboriginal peoples could say, neither Beijing nor Taipei is at home here, we are. So that's my question. The question to the other two, how do you compare the Taiwan issue with the many other similar issues we have even in Europe, even in Switzerland with Jura, which is still an unsettled issue and which could open the door for a lot of cultural exchanges between Taiwan and deLisle. So how do you compare? We have the problem in Catalonia, in Scotland, in Cyprus, etc.
Okay, Mrs. Su, do you want to start with the Aboriginal question?
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is exactly the point. In Taiwan, it's the people, not Chinese. It's the people on Taiwan. The Taiwanese is a collective term where you have Chinese heritage, you have the Aboriginal, the indigenous culture, which is completely different from the Chinese culture. The language is much closer to our brothers and sisters on the Pacific. So in Taiwan, it's the value of Taiwan is that we encompass and we include all the different peoples, be it the Chinese heritage, be it the indigenous culture closer to the Polynesian culture on the Pacific and so on. We are the people, the ruler of Taiwan. So it's this is an effort that we're trying to promote. Of course, I have to admit, there was an embarrassing period of Taiwanese history where indigenous cultures were not highly praised and even, unfortunately, suppressed. But then this is why the current government is now has been very eager to restore the transitional justice for those who have unfortunately sacrificed or suffered during the time, including specifically the indigenous people in Taiwan. So there has been a lot of efforts trying to restore the language, the culture, the way of style, and also to make sure the opportunities were equal for whichever ethnic identity you have on Taiwan.
For the second questions, Dr. Fatton or Jacques deLisle, is there any comparison possible between
Jura and Taiwan? Okay.
Or other European
I will start
case.
because I will be extremely short, and I guess Professor deLisle has some more things to say about that. Well, the main differences between Jura or Catalonia or Pays Basque and Taiwan is that from the political scientist point of view, Taiwan is an independent polity. We have the luxury in political science not actually to be forced to enter the debate about sovereignty, whether it's a country, and etc. It is an independent polity, meaning it has a government, it has an army, it has a central bank, and etc. In other words, whether it's recognized or not, and what we mean by recognizing is not important for us. Catalonia is not an independent polity. It has certain domains of activities, for example, in which it is independent, right? But it doesn't have an army. It doesn't have a central bank. some people in Catalonia, as you know, wants to be independent in terms of political polity, but it is not the case now. Second point that is extremely different, well, Taiwan is at the center of the geostrategic chessboard today. It's really the point in which the tensions between Beijing and Washington are crystallizing. So of course, my grandmother is from Bilbao, lived in Barcelona, so I'm attached to these regions. But I mean, in terms of the consequences of the world of what's happening in Catalonia or the Pays Basque, there is nothing to compare with Taiwan. Taiwan is really here that it's like a black hole in the international system. All the attentions converge them, and we see nowadays that more and more, even the Europeans are basically paying more and more attention, because if it blows over there, everybody will suffer. So that's a big difference with Jura, typically. Well, Ukraine, it's a bit different, but we can talk about it.
So for a political scientist, Professor Fatton is a good lawyer. That is, much of his discussion really goes to the question of how an entity functions in the international system. And so, I did this sort of quick law nerd aside to the constitutive versus declaratory theories of recognition of statehood. Basically the international law on this, and to a significant degree the international politics of this, is we look at the entity and see, does it function with the autonomy that we associate with states, and Professor Fatton has given you a list of many of those factors. But to take one step away from that, is that when you were talking, most of the cases you've cited involve what in international law would be seen as peoples, right? An ethnic, religious, cultural group that is distinct to some degree from the larger society. You see with Quebec in Canada, and that gives you in theory a right to self-determination. Does that give you a right to your own state? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And so you heard a reference earlier to the Taiwanese identity, and as Taiwanese identity has gone up as an identity separate from Chinese, these issues have become more salient. But whether self-determination rights get you a right to an independent state depends on whether you are accommodated in the political life of the larger entity. So if you were to grant the Chinese principle that Taiwan was part of China, they'd have a pretty good argument that if you look at Hong Kong, or if you look at Xinjiang, China does not exactly have an exemplary record of allowing autonomy by these subunits within the country. But the real starting point here is Taiwan is not trying to functionally break away from the People's Republic of China. It would be a question of absorption. And so that makes it 180 degrees around from the Pays Basque or the Greek and Turkish parts of Cyprus, or whatever else you want to put on your list of examples.
Thank you. Another question or comment? Okay.
Say one of the things that what you asked about Ukraine, that is the game in Ukraine. Putin tries to claim Ukraine was not a real state, so it is an attempted secession, just as China tries to portray Taiwan as an attempted succession, whereas much of the world views Ukraine as a state that was attacked by the state next door, and Taiwan's argument is there's an analogy there. Chinese action against Taiwan would be equivalent to Russian action against Ukraine.
I have a last question. We are here at the heart of Europe. We have a very European point of view. I'd like to hear you about the other points of view about the Taiwan question. If you're in Africa, of course in Asia, or in other parts of the world, how different the point of view on the Taiwanese question is. Maybe Lionel Fatton?
So from other point of views than European?
Yeah.
But I will not talk for the others. But what I can tell you, the only thing I can tell you, because I'm almost half Japanese, is from the Japanese point of view, Taiwan is... The Japanese more and more understand now that actually the Taiwan issue is something that is almost an issue of territorial defense for them. It's not only because Yonaguni, the southwesternmost island of Japan, is 100 kilometers away from Taiwan, but because they basically understand that even if, let's imagine, Taiwan is reunified or unified with China peacefully, then the shadow of China, meaning its ability to project power in the Western Pacifics and over Japan, will increase tremendously. In other words, as long as Taiwan remains an independent polity, Japan has somehow, not a buffer, but a way to reduce the pressure by China on itself. And therefore, Taiwan has become, from the Japanese security point of view, something that is vital actually for its national security. And that's why, from my point of view, we see over the past, let's say, 10 years, Japan being more and more active in the cross-strait security dynamics, not only diplomatic, but security dynamics more and more.
Just two quick comments on that. One is that one of Taiwan's challenges is the extent to which the global South has accepted Beijing's view. Taiwan's just not a high salience issue for much of the world. I think it's one of the reasons you've seen Taiwan put so much emphasis on what one could call its moral standing, its democracy, its human rights record, and things like that, as an attempt to gain traction with states that don't have a security stake or a big economic stake in Taiwan. In the United States, well, I mean, obviously we have a long history of how to approach the Taiwan issue. The US official position is one of carefully calibrated agnosticism and trying to stay in the middle of the road, but if you scratch the surface, and if you look especially at recent developments, the US is clearly backing Taiwan more strongly than it has in a long time, even to the point where some say that strategic ambiguity has given way to strategic clarity. I think that's wrong. I think what's going on is the US is still engaged in its long-standing position of trying to keep the status quo, but that now requires increasing signals of support for Taiwan, which is increasingly besieged and where there is doubt about the American commitment. And it requires greater efforts to deter a more powerful and aggressive China. Doing those two things at the same time is very difficult because the more you support Taiwan, the more China thinks the US is supporting an untenable situation in China's view. So it's become a more difficult agenda to pursue what I think is a long-standing position. The US position, of course, is that however you guys work it out is fine. Peaceful unification, peaceful independence, that would be fine. In practice, the US geostrategic calculus is clearly that Taiwan is something of an asset, but you don't say that out loud or people get very upset.
Okay. Thank you. Ambassador Nicole Su would like to have the final word for today before we close the session.
Lastly, I thank you, Isabelle, for organizing this event with our office, and I appreciate very much all your participation and your concern for the Taiwanese situation. I guess today's Valentine's Day, and why today that we're picking today, I think unfortunately we do have an unwelcome suitor near our door, but then I think we have Valentine's here with all our friends, which we appreciate all your friendship, your support, and your concern to the Taiwanese situation. And I think this is a matter, as we have discussed, a matter of global security. This is not only about Taiwan, but for the whole world. So thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you. So, okay. Well, of course, you are available for interviews as well as Messieurs Fatton and Jacques deLisle. Well, thank you so much for you three so interesting presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us today, and Joyeux Saint-Valentin. Thank you. Thank you online.